Today's episode features two Tenali Raman stories about how this court jester outsmarts a greedy lender in a courtroom and also how he sells his house for free. Namaskar and welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. In this episode, we are back to the world of Tenali Raman. If you haven't heard previous Tenali Raman stories, that is perfectly okay, because each of these stories stands alone. I'm about to give you the only context you need. Krishna Devaraya and Tenali Raman were both real historical people. Tenali Raman was a jester in the court of Krishna Devaraya in 16th century India. Krishna Devaraya ruled the Vijayanagar Empire, which covered a massive portion of southern India. But being a court jester doesn't mean that Raman was a fool. Quite the opposite. Tenali Raman was a scholar and also a polyglot. He was a master of 8 different languages. Raman used his wisdom and his knowledge to roast those around him, while also making a quick buck off the side. And the emperor was his victim most frequently. Krishna Devaraya mostly took all of this in good humor, except for all those times that he tried to have his jester punished, banished, executed, and tortured. Raman managed to get out of all such situations. Today's story begins not with the king, but with Raman and his friend. Yeah, despite being quite arrogant and despite his very selfish attitude, Raman had a friend. Kind of. Swarthi was purely a bandwagon buddy. If you aren't familiar with the term bandwagon buddy, it's because I just invented it. In this case, it means someone who is only a friend because they heard it was fashionable to have at least one friend at court. Raman wasn't completely oblivious to all this. He knew that Swarthi was in it only for himself. That's what Swarthi means, anyway. But that didn't stop Raman from chatting with Swarthi. Raman thought that he might also get something out of it. Today, though, Raman was thinking there might be a limit to his patience. Swarthi was going on and on about some guy who was a bandar sometimes. Bandar is the Hindi word for monkey. Or a cheetah sometimes. And somehow a hawk and a bear came into it. Though Raman didn't quite follow how. What's next, Swarthi? Are you opening a zoo? Raman interrupted. Swarthi stared for a full minute before responding. Haven't you been listening, Raman? I was talking about the banker who is quite the cheater. He cheats hawkers like me, and I can't bear it. Raman said that of course he had understood all that. Only a person not paying attention would have misunderstood. So tell me more about this banker of yours, Raman added. He wasn't just trying to mollify Swarthi. Raman could actually sniff an opportunity here. If this banker was a cheater, Raman might be able to make some easy money off of him. So for the next 1 hour, Raman learned everything there was to learn about this banker. Turns out, he wasn't actually a banker. He was more of a rental service provider. Sort of like the 16th century version of Rent-A-Center. It made sense then that his name was Udhar, which literally means a loan or a rental. The model worked like this. Swarthi and other hawkers borrowed pots and pans from Udhar, and they tried to sell them. If Swarthi managed to sell a pan, he had to pay Udhar the cost of the pan. If he didn't sell it, he would simply return it to Udhar. No harm, no foul, just a hefty subscription fee. Like Netflix, but for cookware. Raman went home thinking about this. He kept thinking about this again through dinner. And before he slept, he had an idea. And that contributed to a deep sleep that night. The next day, Raman put his plan into motion. He disguised himself as a hawker, and he showed up at Udhar's doorstep. Udhar looked at the hawker at his doorstep and realized he looked exactly like Udhar's target clientele. A hawker who wasn't very well dressed, meaning he didn't have enough money to feed an army of lawyers. And his clothes weren't terribly tattered either. Extracting money from people at either end of the economic spectrum was rather difficult for Udhar. So, for all the ones in between, Udhar preferred to cook their goose to a perfect medium, crispy but still tender. So Udhar suspected nothing, and Raman readily signed his name on the stamp paper and exited stage left with a dozen silver pots and pans that he had just borrowed. The deal was a next day return of the kitchenware or payment to Udhar. Being a completely new client, Udhar wouldn't agree to any duration longer than a single day. But this suited Raman just fine. So the very next day, Raman returned. But not with Udhar's original dozen silver pots and pans. He returned with 18 pots and pans. Udhar was genuinely taken aback. In retrospect, he should have quietly accepted all 18 pots and pans and not said a single word. But this had never happened to him. No one had given him more pots and pans than he had lent out. Before he could stop himself, Udhar asked, 18? But I only gave you 12 pots and pans. Raman laughed and said, Of course there were 18. You see, Udhar may not have realized it, but some of the pots were pregnant. That's why there were 6 extra tiny pots. And since the parent pots belonged to Udhar, the children did as well. So yeah, that was it. And it wasn't all that unusual, Raman added. He had seen this movie where all the pots and pans were alive Beauty and the Beast, Raman thought it was called, by some guy called Disney Kapoor or Disney Khan or something. Anyway, Raman cheerfully bid Udhar goodbye and said it was a shame that he, Raman, hadn't managed to sell a single pot. But he would be back from next week and borrow more stuff from Udhar. Maybe he would have better luck then. Udhar realized that Raman had gotten confused and accidentally come back with 6 extra pots. Raman must be quite the simpleton to believe that those pots had given birth. Who ever heard of such a thing? But Udhar didn't want to contradict him, especially if he was getting extra pots out of it. So the next week, when Raman, the hawker, was back again to borrow more pans, Udhar nudged him towards the pots. Last time, only the pots had been pregnant, according to Raman. So, it might work this time as well. Worst case, if there were no mix-up with other pots, Raman would have to return the original pots. No matter what, Udhar would come out on top. So imagine Udhar's excitement when Raman asked to borrow gold pots this time, instead of silver. Udhar was going to get even more value out of this than he had anticipated. Udhar spent the whole day being extremely cheerful. 12 gold pots. And that might fetch him 24 gold pots. Well, 12 regular gold pots and 12 little gold pots, to be precise. But little or not, gold was gold. So the next morning, when Raman returned, Udhar was feeling generous and on the cusp of inviting Raman in for a cup of chai. But he stopped when he saw Raman had returned empty-handed. Where were all the pots? He asked Raman. Raman said that he had distressing news, the most terrible news of all. What were the odds of 12 golden pots all passing away during the delivery? Udhar was shocked. What utter nonsense was this? Raman agreed. This was intolerable. How could the government not be taking any steps to protect the health of pots? He had a good mind to dash off a letter right now to King Krishnadevaraya. Udhar was just getting angry now. It was Raman who was spewing nonsense. And if he didn't return Udhar's pots, Udhar threatened to take him to court and bankrupt him. Raman refused, and Udhar did exactly what he had threatened. The case landed before the judge, who was, of course, King Krishnadevaraya. Because you know how he was the king, Supreme Court Justice, and lawmaker all rolled into one person? And he was also the CEO and head of HR. Krishnadevaraya, unaware that Raman was the hawker, called the court to order. If the king had known the identity of the hawker, he might have ruled straight away in Udhar's favor. Krishnadevaraya knew Raman was a sneaky, slimy serpent who stole money from behind people's backs while also ridiculing them. The king had come to this conclusion based on his treasurer reporting to him that the orphans' meal budget had to be cut because the king had handed out far too many bags of gold to Raman. Anyway, Krishnadevaraya heard Udhar's side and turned a stern glance at Raman. Was Raman for real? trying to pass off such a ridiculous story. He instructed the hawker to just return Udhar's pots, and they could both go home, happy. Ah, I would, Raman answered. But first, you must hear the prequel. And so, Raman narrated the incident with the silver pots, and how they had given birth, and how Udhar had readily accepted that. The king's reaction to this was not what anyone expected. He burst out laughing. He sent Udhar home, empty-handed, and told Raman to take off that ridiculous hawker disguise. Of course, he realized that only Raman could have come up with an outrageous plan like this one. The king was a smart cookie in figuring that out. And because he was also generous and easily forgetful as well, he handed Raman another bag of gold, completely missing the distressed glances from the treasurer. That's that for the first story. Let's hope Udhar learned his lesson. But knowing human psychology, it would be hard to bet on it. Anyway, on to the second mini story. Let's assume it carried on right after the first one. "You're a miser, Raman," the king told him. "I'm forced to be a miser, Your Majesty. If I'm not prudent, how can I take care of my children and their future?" "Are you saying, Raman, that in the right circumstances, you would not be stingy with money?" Raman nodded, but Krishnadevaraya found that hard to believe. So Raman had an idea. "I'll tell you what, Your Highness. I'll give away my home for free. It's prime real estate. It's on Millionaire's Row and faces the extensively beautiful Brindavan Gardens. Convenient public transport. There's a bullock cart stop right outside my home." The king's jaw dropped, and actually everyone at court was shocked too. The king made Raman repeat what he had just said. Raman give away his home for free? Made no sense at all. But he gave Raman a chance. To which Raman said that he had one small request. He needed some gold to set up advertising, posters, and so on, to attract buyers from everywhere. The king readily gave him gold. Truth be told, Raman didn't really need any advertising. And he didn't actually spend any money on it. News traveled fast, by word of mouth anyway. There were long lines of prospective buyers outside of Raman's home the next morning. The king himself came along to watch the action. Raman had set up a table and called on each candidate one by one. And the king sat by, observing the brilliant Raman at work. "I'd like to buy this home for nothing. I have nothing, no money. I am your ideal candidate," said an eager buyer. "Now hold on. Do you have your own home?" Raman asked. "Yes, I do, but I'd love to own this one," the buyer replied. It was at this point that Raman pointed at the fine print. Yes, he was going to give away his home for free, but only if the new owner was completely content, completely satisfied with their existing home. "Are you satisfied with your existing home?" Raman asked. The buyer nodded, without anticipating Raman's reply. "If you're satisfied with your existing home, why do you need a new one? Go on, shoo. Next, Raman called out. It was foolproof logic. If the buyer had instead said that he wasn't satisfied, as many others in the queue did, Raman would have simply dismissed them. Because that meant they didn't meet Raman's one and only criterion for the new owner. The king asked, what if a homeless person showed up? The question didn't apply to them, did it? But Raman insisted that it did. To be content with their existing home, they had to have an existing home. The king had more edge cases in mind. Raman had an answer for every one of them. For example, if someone wanted Raman's home and wanted to convert it to something else, a museum, an ice cream parlor, a salon, or a cafe, then, by Raman's criteria, it would not remain a home. And again, that would violate Raman's condition. So there you have it. Raman once again weaseled out of this situation. He mock reluctantly concluded to the king that though he had been more than willing to give away his home, the right kind of person just did not exist. What a shame this was. That's it for this time. Check out previous Tenali Raman episodes. They're linked in the show notes and on the site sfipodcast.com. In the next episode, we'll go back to the Mahabharata. We'll continue the main storyline with the Pandavas and Kauravas locked in an infamous game. The stakes are high after the Pandavas have already lost their personal freedom. Now, Yudhishthir is about to gamble on Draupadi's freedom as well. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. Now, with the latest update, I can actually reply to the questions there, so I'll reply to your comments directly on Spotify. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or comment on Spotify. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. You can listen to the show on all podcast apps as well as YouTube. If you want to send me an email, it's storiesfromindiapodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.